Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Slacky. I'm Director of Public and Government Affairs for AAA Northeast. And I'm delighted to have Ann Blair from the Electrification Coalition joining us this morning for a very timely discussion about electric vehicles throughout the country, throughout the region here in the Northeast. So delighted to have her. She's the Electrification Coalition's Senior EV Policy Manager. She's been working in the transportation policy space for 20 some odd years, and she's on the EV Club of the South, and she lives in Atlanta. So we're hoping to give her a little bit of northern hospitality, having her present to us. So really delighted for the conversation, and take it away. And I will just note for any audience members, if you want to submit any questions, feel free to do so in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alec, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As Alec mentioned, I'm Senior EV Policy Manager at the Electrification Coalition. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that's really committed to promoting policies and actions that facilitate the mass deployment of electric vehicles. And we do that because it's imperative, and our real mission is to combat the economic, environmental, and national security dangers that are caused by our dependence on oil in our transportation sector. We're engaged in several key initiatives where we focus most of our work. Next slide, please. And I want to just highlight a few of our initiatives. We help lead and support the American Cities Climate Challenge, where we help advise on transportation electrification plans. We started the EV Purchasing Collaborative, which helps with the bulk purchase of electric vehicles. We also have local policy accelerators, where we help municipalities and states really dig deep to advance policy in those particular areas. Next slide, please. Specifically, our policy work includes deep engagement in a handful of states all around the country. We've developed policy blueprints, host events, and work directly to engage leaders in the adoption of those policies on transportation electrification. We work closely with the Business Council, and this is a highlight of some of our members, not all of them, but we work in close partnership with many of the business industry to help successfully move these policies throughout the country. Next slide, please. So today I'm really going to focus on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan and the importance of this. There has been a lot of charging infrastructure that's been deployed throughout the country. It's meeting many people's needs, but there's still large gaps that exist, and most of those in more rural areas, but then also in multifamily housing units. And we believe that we need full access, everyone needs access to be able to charge and fuel their vehicle, because the growth in electric vehicles is accelerating. The EV moment is now, and we really need more infrastructure and if we're going to realize the potential. So next slide, please. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This is a law that was passed and signed into law on November 15th of last year. In its entirety, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law distributes an unprecedented $1.2 trillion that is set to revitalize the nation's infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, but also charging infrastructure. Accelerating transportation electrification is one of the cornerstones of this bill, of this and now law. It specifically includes what we consider a down payment of more than $15 billion for electric vehicles. That includes support for electric vehicle supply equipment, or shorthand charging equipment. Also includes money for electrifying school buses. More than $5 billion have been allocated to electrify school buses. And then also funding for battery processing and manufacturing of EVs. This investment will be composed of direct allocations to state governments, but it also includes competitive grant program to which smaller municipalities and private industries will be able to apply for that funding. We believe that the passage of this law and its implementation really marks the start of the EV moment, as I mentioned earlier, for our country, and represents a critically needed opportunity for transportation electrification. For all the reasons we mentioned, we're doing this work to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, provide for cleaner air in our communities. So I've highlighted here, there's $5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations specifically along highways, and that will be determined by the National EV Charging Formula. So each state will get a set amount of funding. 2.5 billion will be for grants, and about half of that is specifically for communities to fill in areas in disadvantaged communities and rural areas. 2.5 billion for electric school buses specifically. And then there's another 2.5 billion that is allocated for alternative fuel school buses. That can include electric, but it also could include propane buses or compressed natural gas or others. Of course, we'd like to see all of this money go specifically for electrifying all of those buses. That program will be administered by EPA. The other programs will be administered by a joint office of the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy. And then there is $6.1 billion for the battery processing and manufacturing, as well as recycling, because we want to make sure that we're getting the most out of this transition. All right, next slide, please. So to highlight what's next, there's been this large announcement. So what's next? Well, really to maximize the potential of the law, DOT and DOE have created a joint office of energy and transportation. This new office will facilitate a modernized and interagency approach to support the build out of charging stations. And they specifically stated that they want them to be convenient, accessible, and equitable. The program will be officially launched this afternoon in just about 2 hours. There's going to be an event at the DOT office, and they will be releasing the publication of a 31-page guidance document that will provide directions to states and municipalities how they should go about implementing this program. Next slide, please. Most of the money will flow through the state departments of transportation, and the federal government is encouraging states to establish state coordinators for deploying that infrastructure. The emphasis will be on building charging primarily along identified alternative fuel corridors. And there will be a particular emphasis in this first phase of the funding on rural and underserved communities. It does require states to develop plans for how the money will be spent before it will be released to the states. So it's in the best interest of the states to develop their own infrastructure plan and submit that. If a state decides that they do not want to submit a plan, they have written in the guidance that they would then distribute it to other states or potentially directly to municipalities if they develop their own plans, which municipalities can do. Metropolitan planning organizations can do that. Others also will be able to submit their own plans. The goal is that charging stations would be deployed every 50 miles. And also along those major corridors, but then also it could be used for other accessible areas, including public parking facilities, schools, and parks. The money will be sent over to the states over the next 5 years. And for 2022, there'll be a total of $615 million. And as I mentioned earlier, There's a set amount that'll go for each state, and that information can be found on the White House's website, as well as the new EV charging website that DOT and DOE will be releasing this afternoon. All right, so one of the other things I wanted to highlight about what we've been told will be in the guidance release this afternoon is that the funds will require an 80-20 cost share, meaning that the state or private funds must make up 20% of the project's funding. The cost of developing plans by the states is reimbursable in the federal funding pots. One of the other provisions that's included is an environmental justice component. As a part of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, the agency said that at least 40% of the benefits of these investments will go to disadvantaged communities. So those are the main highlights of the program. I wanted to highlight just a few other things. This, of course, is primarily for charging infrastructure, and we believe that we also need supplemental policies that will help deploy more vehicles into the market. There are provisions in the Build Back Better Act that is still under consideration in Congress that would include purchase incentives to lower the incremental cost of EVs and make more EVs accessible to more Americans. Also include an EV manufacturing tax credit and support for federal fleet transition. And we think that getting these types of provisions also passed to supplement the bipartisan infrastructure program will be really important to moving transportation electrification forward in the most efficient way possible. So I wanted to share those general highlights of what we are expecting to see out of the guidance that's going to be released today, overview of the program, and would love to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Ann. Really informative and great presentation. And a few questions kind of come to mind for me initially. Thinking about states having to submit plans. I think all 5 of our states already do plenty of work on electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations. Do you think there's a possibility that there are states around the country that choose not to submit the plans, and that there might be, even a slightly higher pot of funds that we could tap into?
I mean, I think there is potential. There are some states that we work with, some that I know very well, that have not yet developed their own plan for this. And I don't know what the current plans are, but some of the metropolitan planning organizations in these states are developing their plans. So I don't think we, for instance, would necessarily fully be at a disadvantage from getting the funds, but I do think there are some states that are going to have more difficulty or may or may not choose to deploy or develop these plans. I don't know that for sure. I think it would be a real missed opportunity for those states, but it's happened before with other federal funding pots, so it's possible.
So a question about kind of the alternative fuel corridors that are the basis for a lot of existing electric vehicle charging station policy, and I think will continue to be the basis based on the provisions of the bill. Mm-hmm. I know right now there's, I would say, a lot of leeway as to what could be considered a corridor if you have stations up to 50 miles apart and they could be up to 5 miles from the highway. Do you have a sense of whether that might be tweaked, or what the Electrification Coalition is looking for and how to optimize that?
Yeah, I think the initial phase of this funding, at least in the first year, what we're hearing from that joint office is they do want a specific focus along the interstate corridors. So I think there will be some prioritization of getting that deployed first. I also understand that, the guidance may change and be updated, over time as some of the charging deployment begins to happen. And I think we are very open to that happening. This is something we haven't done before. Yes, electric vehicles have been around for a really long time, but in terms of mass adoption, we're trying things out. There's going to be different business models for deploying the infrastructure, who owns, who operates that infrastructure. So I think that there needs to be room for some flexibility in the guidance, while also holding our states and communities accountable for getting charging infrastructure to increase reliability of drivers in electric vehicles, and also to get more people in EVs, because we know that our transportation system contributes the largest percentage of our carbon dioxide emissions today, and so we really need to clean up our transportation sectors, and electrification can help us do that. So I think we need to be open and flexible, but also move these things forward as quickly as we can.
When I was looking at the bill, I was struck by the fact that they have maybe not an emphasis, but they call out that funds can be used for operating assistance, I think up to 5 years, as well as installation, at least for some of the formula grants. I guess kind of a broad question is, what's the best way for states to make these plans to make sure that they're not just building out chargers that don't get maintained, that sit unused, and that a few years down the road need to be totally replaced?
Yeah, I think public-private partnerships are going to be really important. People working together, coming together to figure out how to best do this. Utilities have a really important role because they are providing the electricity that are going to power these vehicles. Private industry has a really important role because many of those charging companies, they know how to operate these systems. So there's going to need to be some strong partnerships. DOTs and municipalities need to make sure they have strong relationships with their utilities so that they can get to them, talk to them early and often about what some of the power needs are, because there's going to need to be some new substations built, new facilities, new lines, depending on where the charging infrastructure. There may need to be new ones, but we can tap into our existing system as well, but there may need to be some upgrades. And so communicating with utilities first and finding out where there may already be, good locations based on where their networks are in proximity to the other provisions. Every 50 miles, is it a good, safe location? What's the ownership model? So all of those things need to be really well coordinated. So, again, public-private partnerships are really important.
I guess kind of getting down to brass tacks here, obviously this is a huge investment into electric vehicle chargers. How far does this get us in terms of where we need to be 5 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and I won't probably give you a direct answer. We do need a lot more charging, depending on how fast vehicle adoption happens. But we know that it's coming. All the major manufacturers have made significant investments and or will be making additional investments in converting their manufacturing to electric. So we also need to recognize that much of the charging also will happen at home. If you are an EV driver, you know that you do this. In terms of public charging, you need it to go on trips, but a good majority of existing EV drivers, we do 80 to 90% of our charging at home. So, what types of charging and where it's located, those are other important components. We don't necessarily need to put lower, power charging, in the main corridors, but strategically locating the charging is really important.
Great, and we actually have a question specifically about rural communities and what's being done to incentivize adoption of EVs in rural communities. I know you touched on that as part of the presentation. Can you give a little more insight as to the plans there?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. We had a question about rural communities and what's being done specifically to incentivize adoption there.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, and sorry I didn't catch that. So as I mentioned, there is a portion of the funding that will specifically be designated for rural communities. And Department of Transportation did release just last week a new rural EV toolkit. It is a great resource. And it has some general guidance. It's kind of a big document, but it has some really important guidance about how you can go about installing charging. And then our organization, kind of as a complement, knowing that was coming out, have also developed a guidebook to support rural communities. Like what are the things that you need to begin considering if you want to deploy charging infrastructure. So similar to what I just mentioned, talking to your utilities, meeting with your planning organizations, finding out what some of the permitting requirements are going to be, and if there's any zoning or other changes that may need to be made to ensure that the charging can be installed as quickly as possible.
Makes sense. And I guess a question about the equity-focused provisions, and this is something that I think about a lot because I don't want to say now is the only big investment, certainly not, but this is, a generational investment, we hope, and we need to make sure that we're investing in chargers in underserved communities. At the same time, we know that at least currently, EV ownership is skewed more towards wealthier areas. So there is a worry that if you put stations in low income or charging stations in low income areas, they might not get as much use the first couple of years, and that could be a public relations problem for the investment. How do you square that circle? I know that's the $5 billion question here, but how do you square that circle?
Yeah, I think we need to be honest with ourselves. There are going to be some charging stations that are not going to be as utilized and totally make the money back on that investment. But reliability and dependability, that having that charging station there when it's needed is going to be really important. And so that's why I think the different business models and having different approaches will be important. Utilities, for instance, whether you're talking about rural electric co-ops or larger utilities, the fact that they often get to rate base their investments in charging infrastructure, I think will be important to making the case and letting them do what they do best, providing infrastructure for the public. So I think they have an important role to play in this and filling some of those gaps where it might not make a lot of sense for the private industry to do so.
Makes sense. And we have another question here about are there any provisions to make sure that that the chargers are getting electricity from renewable energy sources?
So I know that is a general recommendation. As far as I know, there are no requirements currently to do that. But of course, it is incredibly important. As our grid gets cleaner, that means our cars will get cleaner as well. And we want to make sure that we aren't, just fueling our cars on fossil fuel-based energy, but we are doing it increasingly with renewables. But currently, there are not additional provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There are some additional provisions in the Build Back Better Act, additional tax credits for solar and wind and other renewables, which again, similar to the EV tax credits, we think will be important to in the big picture, to make the sector cleaner overall.
And I have a question from someone in a municipality or a city here in Connecticut, who wants to know, are there any restrictions in accepting the funds, and how can they apply? Is there anyone they should be, advocating to?
Yeah, so there are going to be some specific requirements. We will learn more with this guidance document that is coming out soon. There will also be another document coming out in May that's specific standards guidance for the charging stations. And so, these things are happening a little bit in phases. In terms of what you need to be, doing to figure out how to access this, begin building a relationship with your DOT as well as with US DOT and this joint office. And certainly feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in contact with some folks about it. But they've got a great new website that it also includes a technical assistance link. So they're developing a technical assistance resource to help communities just like yours get the answers to these questions and all the timelines for the distribution of the different funding.
Great. And another question coming in about trucks and how the the plans for electric charging stations will or won't help freight access to those stations.
Yeah, that's another question that we haven't gotten clarification yet on from DOT, if there is going to be any sort of prioritization for light duty versus supporting the freight sector. It's going to need to be an important piece of the evolution of deployment of these funds, but as I understand, at least in the near term, it's about helping consumers get through along interstate highways, but certainly as there are more long haul trucks that are electrified and others, but I think we're going to see that phased in as more of those vehicles come to market.
And I know one issue that's kind of bubbled up here locally is we're thinking about interstates and highways, and rest areas and travel plazas seem to be a logical place to put the charging stations, but in some cases there are restrictions on commercial activity and putting those charging stations there. Do you see an appetite for tweaking that provision to allow the installation of the chargers?
Yeah, it's a very hot topic right now. We would like to see changes to that. We think there is a lot of opportunity to utilize that space at rest areas. And we are hopeful that DOT, working with the White House and Congress, will come up with a strategy that will enable that over time. But it's a hot conversation right now. Yep.
Sounds like it. And just kind of transitioning to the Build Back Better provisions that are on hold for now. When you're looking at the vehicle incentives, at least, in the past that was kind of manufacturer based, right? Your possibility for getting an incentive was different based on which manufacturer you chose. Do you anticipate if this is able to move forward that there's going to be a similar sort of framework, or would it be a very different framework?
There are several different tax credit provisions. There are some specifically for manufacturers and also direct to consumers. There has been a larger effort with this go round to not put those caps on manufacturers and instead open it up and remove those restrictions. So that's something that is included in the most recent. There's also an additional used EV tax credit as well, because we know that, even we need to get, more vehicles to the market, but we also need to ensure that there's assistance in making sure that those used vehicles also stay in our country. We saw early days of the Nissan Leaf, where many of the used Leafs were actually being, shipped back over to Europe. for folks to meet their, climate goals as well. And we'd like to make sure there's a robust used market here in the US as well. And so there's also a used tax credit included in the Build Back Better.
Great, thanks. Thanks a bunch. And I'll just get to the last question. Thinking about the states in our region, so New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, what are we doing well here, and what can we be doing better?
Yes, so many of those states have developed transportation electrification plans. Also, several of the utilities in the area as well have developed their own plans. I think there's additional room for growth as well, particularly as it relates to medium and heavy duty vehicles, looking at some state-based policy as well as local policy that will set new standards for bringing more electric medium and heavy duty vehicles into each state. There are different policies that can do that. If your state has not yet adopted, for example, the ZEV standards, the zero emissions vehicle standards, that is an opportunity, as well as the advanced clean truck rule, or signing on to the medium and heavy duty memorandum of understanding that is being led by NESCOM in the Northeast. So those are some of the standard-based policies, as well as additional incentives to help support not just the infrastructure, but also vehicle purchases, particularly for fleets and individuals.
Well, thanks so much, Ann, for a really great conversation, superb presentation. I really enjoyed it. I hope all the audience members did as well. Thanks for submitting your questions. And we are out of time, but we hope you can join us next week. On Thursday, we're going to be talking to the National League of Cities about opportunities for cities and towns and municipalities. So we're really excited about that. We're happy to share the recording with anyone who attended and anyone who didn't attend afterwards, so they can view it at their leisure. And with that, Ann, thanks so much, and enjoy the next couple of days. I'm sure it's a very, very busy time for you.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity, and we'll include those website links in the follow-up. I'll get those to you, Alec, if you don't have them.
Excellent.
Great.
Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.